Hello, this is a lecture about the Neoplatonic philosophy of numerical unity from the time of Plotinus, going through Augustine to that of Jacobi. And this covers some of what I talked about in the essay and goes through a couple of practical applications about consequences. They illustrate the consequences of the Neoplatonic thought about numeric unity. So what we're going to talk about is a summary of what I talk about in the essay and those mathematical processes that show the consistency, as well as consider some questions at the end for our discussion. And so beginning with a timeline, we have Plotinus, who lived around 205 to 270, and then Augustine, who wrote De Libero Arbitrio Voluntatis in 387 to 395, in which he talks briefly about number, counting. And then we have Carl Gustav Jacob Jacobi, who was in the 19th century. And then throughout these times, Neoplatonic philosophy of numeric unity emphasized the irreducibly simple, complete, indivisible, and the fact that number one, numeric unity, is implied in other numbers. Meaning that if you have a number, then one is somehow hidden in there in ways that will be defined. So these are intuitive notions, but we're going to define them rather a little bit rigorously, but I'm going to try to go through it quickly because going through it too deliberately actually obscures the very intuitive nature of this kind of definition of numeric unity. So before we do that, however, some things to know about Neoplatonism is that if you're a Neoplatonist, there are two realities: the universal things, the things that are they are the universal forms that define the other things, the particular things, the things that exist in this world. The floor that I'm kneeling on, the podium that this laptop is supporting, the podium that is supporting this laptop, and these particular things are said to participate in the universal forms. So the number one has unity, and unity is the form, and the number one participates in that. And so from this unity that we observe in things, not just the number one, we can ascribe unity to other things. We can ascribe being to things that have unity. So being follows unity. So if I look at a tree, it's one tree. It's a united whole thing, substance, living organism. And it has being. Because I can think of it as one thing, I can point at it and say that it exists. And then it has number, so it has quantity. Because it exists, we can say it has a quantity of one. Or if we're looking at a group of things, it's got more than a quantity of one. If we're looking at a group of caribou, then we're looking at several, a quantity of greater than one, multiplicity. So beginning from that understanding, we can talk about Plotinus, who was an Egyptian Neoplatonist who was born around 205 and died roughly 270. He talks about numeric unity in the way that I describe as having irreducible simplicity and these other things. So very briefly, he talks about the one being irreducibly simple in value and expression. So in other words, one, you can't get more basic than one. If you have two of something, then you have two units. You have two things that are themselves one. So really it all boils down to one. And similarly in expression, the way we talk about one is not, you don't say, oh, you have two halves of a tree, you say you have one tree. So that's kind of more, that's more the way that is thought of as one, as being irreducibly simple, both in value and in the way we express that value. So from there, we also have completeness in numeric unity, meaning that it lacks nothing. If we ascribe the value of one to something, if we say this thing that I'm looking at has a quantity of one, if I'm looking at a tree or a plant or a person, I'm looking at one person, and I'm not looking at more than at something. If I'm looking at a person, I'm looking at something that is exactly one person. You can't look at a person and look at 1.5 or 1.3 of a person or 0.9 of a person. You're looking at exactly one thing. So it's complete. It doesn't lack or is not in excess of anything. Also, it is indivisible. This is related to the fact that it's irreducibly simple. If it's irreducibly simple, it doesn't have parts, and therefore you cannot divide it into parts. Plotinus says that if, for example, this is not his example, if you have a hunk of cheese and you divide it into slices, you no longer have a hunk of cheese, you have, say, 5 slices of cheese. The hunk is it disappeared. It no longer has, you can no longer call it a hunk. It's no longer the thing that it was. It doesn't participate in the universal form of chunkness. So it is implied by numbers, meaning that if you have a number, then 1 is somehow hidden in there. Plotinus doesn't talk about this in a super mathematically rigorous way, but he says that if I'm looking at something that is more than one thing, if I'm looking at a group of 10 chairs in a row, and I consider those 10 chairs in a row as a thing, as something belonging to, say, a set, then we can think of that set as one set of 10 elements. And similarly, we can think of it as 10 ones. So we can think of it as 110, as one decad, as he would say, or as 10 of one unit. And so moving on to Augustine, who was a Roman, first a student, and he became a teacher, and he became a bishop. He talks in his On Free Choice of the Will, in his treatise on free choice of the will, briefly about number. He talks about multiplication and basic counting, and he wrote this in 387 to 395. He talks also about using mostly, he either mentions explicitly or sort of assumes these same ideas that Plotinus had. And he says that one is irreducibly simple, meaning that nothing is more basic to it. Although Augustine, an important thing to note about Augustine is that he does not say, he denies that there is any real unity in this world. So you can look at anything you like and see that it is made up of parts. And he says, he doesn't seem to say that this has an end, although he doesn't say that it doesn't have an end. But he says that we ascribe unity to things by just simply denying that it has parts, or ignoring for the sake of convenience that it has parts, and say, this is one thing. It's irreducibly simple. He also says that it's complete. The way he does this is different from Plotinus. He says, well, look at a thing in the world and classify it, give it a name, put it in this category. If it lacks something to be in that category, then you've misclassified it. If you see that it has something more than what it needs to be in that category, then you've misclassified it. So if we're thinking in terms of number, call something 1. If it turns out that you measure it and it's more than what you thought was the unit, if you think that the length or width of a space bar is 1 inch, and then you measure it and you find that it is less than an inch, then you don't have a unit. In other words, so the thing that we name it is the standard by which we measure it. And if it meets that standard, then we have one thing. In other words, it is neither an excess nor a deficiency, so it is complete. It is the thing itself. It is indivisible because, since it's irreducibly simple, it doesn't have parts. Again, Augustine says that it actually does have parts, but we ignore them. Otherwise, we could go crazy just overanalyzing things. And he says, in a very mathematically simple way, he gives a purely mathematical argument that, look, 1 times a thing is the thing that you multiplied 1 by to get. So 1 times x is x. And so we see that even in non-unit numbers, and things that have what Plotinus would call multiplicity